So guys,
Happy
I'm
to
going
be
to jump
here.
right into it so we can get started here, because I think this is a very good topic of conversation. So Eden, this question's for you. What are client-side application security risks, and can you tell us a little bit about how they're performed technically?
Yes, happily. So thanks for the introduction, Brian. I would just say in the beginning that I'm Idan. I'm the CEO of co-founder of Reflectees, a cybersecurity company focused on that area of client-side security. Now, today, when we're thinking about a given website, and in this case, in forum on a retail website, we all know that we are using dozens, if not hundreds, of what we are calling client-side applications or third-party applications. Those are pieces of code, applications, that actually running real-time on our users, on our clients, on our consumers, but their code is actually most of the time dedicated by us. So we have a chatbot that belongs to some kind of third-party vendor, and we have some kind of analytic tools belongs for another vendor or some open source from the internet. So actually, when those codes running on their users, they have access to our user data, and in the famous notorious Mates card web scheming, actually for the credit card number possibly or stuff like this. But the current security tools today are not used to think on the client-side area. And that's what made the client-side app security risk so higher. So we have those all type of apps that have possibly access to my user data, by the way, by malicious or by mistake, bad configuration or an attack, can be both. And today, it's very hard to block them. Technically speaking, the idea is that any one of your consumers, buyers, are logging into your website, want to buy something, they're actually loading the website, the pages on their own browser, on their own Chrome, on their own Firefox. And when the browser is loading the site to display you the best offer today or the best product today, it's loading automatically on your own browser, not on the server, not in the retail shop, on your own computer. It's loading all those client-side apps code. What those codes decide to do, it's now their own decision in theory. So the site owner can't really know what's going on there. He can hope that they're doing what they're supposed to do. He can ask them before, but in the end, when the code is running on the user, on your buyer, consumer browser, it's up to them. And that's what we are talking today about, the client-side risk, the blind spot of client-side risk. Thousands of lines of code, hundreds of applications, all running on our own consumers, on our own retailers, buyers, and without good option today to protect.
Thank you. Dan, this next question is for you. You know, you're leading one of the biggest e-com platforms in the world. How do you see this new threat rising?
I actually I think that's my favorite part from a storyline standpoint as it relates to this threat type. You know, it's not the oldest thing in the world, especially from an AppSec standpoint. You know, it's not like cross-site or SQL injection in terms of vulnerabilities, classic vulns, if you will, that have been with us for, you know, decades. I think, you know, what's fascinating here, I think, is when you've got an attack type that is maturing, meaning that's not a flash in the pan or just a trend, you know, something like MageCart's been around for, you know, 7 years or so. If it's really good, you know, it starts to mature, right? So you've got this, just like we have, you know, life cycles for everything. You've got this, you know, someone figures it out, the initial creator or researcher, or whatever the case might be. Then you get a couple of groups that adopt it. And then if the attack type is really good in terms of ROI from the attacker standpoint, you know, eventually you end up with it as a service. And I think that's certainly the story of MageCart. I think that's when things get really scary, because it just, the easier it becomes from the attacker standpoint, the worse it is from the defender standpoint. The thing that has always helped from an application security standpoint is that a lot of the attacks were, you know, took some level of effort. Not like understanding SQL injection or cross-site might be necessarily very difficult relative to other attack types, but still you have to understand the application on the other side. It's harder to do the classic, spray and pray sort of types of attacks. And so that's always been a leg up from the defender standpoint, is the attackers generally have to care to a degree to really come after you. The more these attack types mature, the easier it gets for them, the worse it gets for us. So, it's the classic question of scale. And I'd say from the defender standpoint, that's what's scary about these kinds of attacks, is the scale has gotten better. We haven't necessarily found really good ways to make that difficult from a broad attack surface standpoint. It's really been because applications are, of course, not necessarily unique, but can be specialized. That changes the dynamic. So, that's the way I look at it anyway.
Thank you.
If I can add, I will also say, and Dan is fully right here, when you're loading those type of apps, you're actually loading applications that many other websites are using. There are standards, especially in the retail area. I think I can find apps that are running on almost all the biggest retailers in the States. That means for me as an attacker, and I made my entire career from the attacking point of view, instead of finding the specific vulnerability in a multi-billion-dollar company that maybe have so many developers and security guys trying to protect, for me, to find the bad spot, the bad configuration, the bad security in some open source that everyone load and not even think about it, or some maybe other company that everyone want to use because it's cool, but they don't have the amount of resource and security team and expertise as the other companies that are using it, you're actually giving me an excellent place to start. Why not breach? Why breaching only one retail if I can hack 50, 100, 200 sites with just one attack? That before we started today, Dan just sent me a tweet about a new web skimming malware that infected more than 100 stores in one attack. That's something that you can't get. You can't have it if you're trying to breach a specific website. If you're going to client side, the ability to go from one attack for hundreds, even thousands of sites in one attack, that's a game changer for me as an attacker point of view. And that's why we are seeing this trend of going from the classic server side, which we are all used to hear about OS top 10, SQL injection, and we know all of our OS top 10, we know for decades, I think. And to go to new client-side attacks that have a lot of abilities or to double, or as Dan said, to scale the winning of a successful breach.
And all interesting and good points. And that brings us to the next question. Idan, web security, it's not something new, right? There's a lot of vendors out there who have different options today. So why do we need a new tool?
Well, so as I said, and I think Dan said it also, until the last few years, we mainly focus on protecting our own code. We had our own developers team, and we invest a lot of money in making sure they know how to write the code. We call it the code review. We bought SaaS solutions, static code analysis to verify the code. We then have the DAS to run the code, and we did penetration testing to test the code, and we focused mainly on making sure the code we created is the best code in the world. And I have to tell you today, if you're going to the common retailer in the US, I think this is the status. We have a best practices today. We have good training abilities today. I don't think you're going to find easily classic XSS or SQL injection in production today. You can find it, but it's much more rare. But then the world is starting to change. And we know that instead of creating your own application and spend weeks or months or years of developers' time and resources, which is expensive today, you can just outsource most of the functionality that you have on a given website. As I said before, why to create your own chatbot if you can go for many other vendors and just buy for a couple dollars their own chatbot solution? Why to design the best graph with the nicest colors if you can just download one of the frameworks you have today that's coloring everything for you? So we actually outsource many parts of our websites to an outsourced code. But what we had in security until today is mainly to protect my own code and not the third-party code. When I'm doing penetration testing, I'm not testing my vendor code. I'm not allowed to run exploits on my vendor. I'm running exploits on my own code. And that is a big blind spot today. So we are protecting, it's important to have web security. We have the WAF, making sure the payloads are secured. We have the code review, making sure the app is best written. We're doing training for developers. But then we are going to production. We're connecting our site for dozens of hundreds of other applications and just hope that their security level is the same level of us. Sometimes it's working. And sometimes we are in the news being breached to some kind of a new attack. Dan, you want to add something?
I think you guys just hinted at what our present and our future is with security overall. Not just an AppSec or a client-side issue. It is a overall maturation of tech. You know, I mean, we're still using things, you know, based on, you know, Fortran, and, you know, many of us lived through Y2K, and, you know, we still see so many things still based on, you know, I mean, our web browsers are still fundamentally based on older programming languages for the most part. So it's, you know, you have to ask yourself, like, you know, what old code is going to be running on, you know, the Starship Enterprise? You know, how long do we keep this stuff with us? It's like luggage. You know, you carry around these foundational aspects of tech for a very long time. And I think what's changed, as was just highlighted, you know, you went from essentially trying to be really good at QA for your own, you know, your own code, your own product. Which is the way I kind of look at that classic AppSec practice. Whereas now the fear, of course, and retail really is the prime example of this. I mean, going back to, you know, breaches almost a decade ago now and longer. You know, why go after an individual when you can go after a customer base? That's now changed to why go after a individual or a customer base when you can go after a tech stack? And I think that's what we have been seeing with, you know, attacks. Log4j, probably the greatest recent example. You know, the more popular something gets, whether it be a language, you know, a foundational piece of tech, you know, everybody's building on top of something else, is my point. And when you build, you know, you have to ask yourself, does it end up being a house of cards? And you know, as everyone has pointed out, whether it's open source or third party, the ability for attackers to chase a broader market, a much larger attack surface than they historically could. I think that's both the present and the future. And exactly to your question, you know, why do we need a new solution? Why do we need? Mainly because it's all about scale. You've just got to cover your bases as much as possible. So to have something in place that scales to, in our case, you know, tens and tens of thousands of sites, that was the name of the game for us in terms of defense. And you know, obviously, given how much retail has changed on you know, in terms of e-commerce and the internet overall, but especially obviously, you know, post or during COVID. You know, again, the risks have only gone up due to the fact that the attack surface and the audience, the ability to make money and in the defender's case lose money is just gone up, you know, drastically. So it kind of goes back to my comments about something like MageCart. You know, you've got that life cycle. Well, you've also got that's kind of the micro. You've got the larger macro life cycle that's happening in security and the threat landscape overall. And it's those types of attacks that has to change your mindset in terms of defense. It's no longer the onesie twosie vulnerabilities is kind of my point.
Interesting. And Dan, you mentioned some of the, you know, like some of the unique challenges, like everyone building on top of something else, right? You know, obviously, you know, you guys are a e-com platform. You know, how does how does security look differently for you guys? And does your customer expect to get security built in?
I think that's a natural progression to tackle the last part of that question. And it's actually something I tend to focus on, is what is the expectation of the customer in the marketplace, because I think increasingly that will be, the interesting thing about an e-commerce platform or any shared platform, the cloud, in general, there's an aspect of it where the provider owns a certain aspect of security, and then there's a part of security that you own, right? AWS gives you the S3 bucket. It's your job to set the security on it, and it's the same thing, regardless of what the model is. And so I think the question from any kind of e-commerce provider is not only where is that line, but are you communicating it well and informing, educating, and enabling your customers to not only understand that, but be able to do something about it easily and effectively. And I think that's where something like the Reflective solution was very attractive to us, was the scalability, and I can go on more about this later, but everybody says scale it, right? It's a very easy thing to say. It's a very hard thing to do. And when you're talking about really big websites and a lot of revenue moving through them, you really have to strive to get it right. It's not one of those things where you can. It's tough to learn as you go, is kind of my point on that. What was so I tackled the last part of your question. Remind me what the first half of it was.
Well, the first, being an e-commerce platform, how
Right.
does it work differently, right?
Yeah, you see so many different things. I think that's also the interesting aspect of having a really broad customer base. You're going from mom and pop SMB up to really large enterprise. So I'd say, and not every hosting provider or not every retailer might be in that position. Although I think it's increasingly happening. There is a lot of, you're seeing way more what were classically B2C type companies, going into B2B. So I think that's transforming as well. But I think that's the interesting aspect for me at BigCommerce, is trying to come up with strategies that tackle and enable all those various levels. Enterprise customers typically know far more about security. A lot of these things aren't going to surprise them. They're going to be way more, they'll have far more questions, concerns about, security type of related stuff. Whereas, your mom and pop operations, not so much. But they might both very well have an expectation of, hey, what are you doing for me on this front, and what do I have to do? So, the questions are the same. Again, the scale is different. But I think what happens naturally over time is that customers do, expect more and more there. I think the difficulty with InfoSec has always been, though, right? You can do more, but it costs, and that's always the rub. And so, people don't want to pay more for security is the issue. And so I think that's why it's a very slow maturation. If you get a group of security pundits together, someone will eventually ask the very high level question, well, why can't we just solve these things? Why is it taking us so long? And I think that's an aspect of it. Obviously, you've got the dynamics with things changing, but just the fact that to secure something at a very high level, Fort Knox, for example, costs a lot of money.
And Idan, those unique aspects of that type of enterprise platform, how does a company like Reflective, and other client-side platforms address challenges when working with like a huge platform like BigCommerce?
So BigCommerce is a very interesting example because they are just huge platform. So when you're maybe trying to protect your own website, one website, two websites, maybe you can make some adaptations, change the size, manage the libraries of the script, and start to protect yourself. But you're running a platform that have tens of thousands of sites, all of them with different needs. Some of them want to have special logouts, special checkout forms, special offering. And you want to have a solution that will allow them to enable them to do their business, but we still be able to protect them without the need to specifically configure every one of the sites. That's a big challenge. So when we talk with Dan and his team, when we started with them, we know that the biggest challenge for us as the vendor is to prove to them, and actually for us, we're able not to scan one shop of BigCommerce, not to scan 5 shops of them, to scan tens of thousands of shops of them without affecting their performance, without affecting the ability to use the platform to what they're planning to do, to have an online shop. And not only to have it in scale, but still to point them to the specific problem they want to know. In security today, there is a big problem, not only in retail, we are calling it the alert fatigue problem. So we are installing many security tools, even outside of the web client-side area, and you're getting thousands of high alerts. And after you get scared for the first 5 minutes, you understand that, okay, we have thousands of alerts, but we are still okay. And you're starting to ignore everything because you just can't handle getting thousands of alerts per day. So when we thought how we are going to support and provide real value to BigCommerce, we know that we need to have 2 things connected. First, the technology ability to support this kind of scale, they are big platform, but still to provide them with the actual problems and actual results we want them to improve. We know that if we create for them thousands high alerts per day, they will just kick it out. We are not going to help them in any way. And that's a very big challenge, not only with BigCommerce, with the major enterprises. Retail that have thousands of shops around the world, some of them in other countries, different languages, different area, different usability per site. So the ability to support the scale, not hurting the performance, not jeopardizing the user experience, and not spam them with alert that will point it outside of their focus of the important stuff. That's what for us was the challenge, the pain we need if a vendor wants to support clients like BigCommerce and others.
Now, Dan, how do you see, client-side application security impacting your business and the priorities you have for like solving these types of challenges?
I love this question because it's so easy to answer. When I got to BigCommerce a year and a half ago, this type of attack would have been one of my primary concerns. Today, it's one of my least concerning. So that's a win. That's a big win. I would. There's a lot I could add to this, I suppose. I spent 20 years on the vendor side myself. I'm not shy about the vendors that I really like. And people's opinions change on technology and vendors all the time. And the reason I think why the vendor, and you have to admit, I see a lot of security people in general, everybody likes to hate on the vendors, but we're all vendors. We're all in business. And how many leaders have you said, have you heard, always say it's about the people, and it really is. I would say our partnership with Reflectors has been awesome, not just because of the tech. People tend to focus on the tech because that's what we always do somehow, right? Going back to security pundits, right? People, process, and technology, but what are we actually going to talk about? Technology. But I think the real vacuum in the InfoSec industry overall, in my opinion, over the last 7 years or so, has really been on the people and process front. The tech has not drastically changed. If anything, we see tech recycled, and some features are added onto it, and it's a new company, and we see the cycle play out over and over again. And why do vendors rise and fall? Sometimes it is about the tech. A lot of times it's about the people. And so, why do I not worry about it the way I did a year and a half ago? If maybe you can be really good. In my case, it's generally more about luck. And I'd say we've lucked out, you know, with the right people on both sides. And that's, you know, again, easy things to say, right? Scalability being an easy word to say, relationship, partnership, also easy things to say. Hard to do and hard to pull off. But I think when both sides of the equation are taking the problem very seriously, and I think that's where vendors really find success, is if you, there's understanding the threat landscape, but there's also understanding your customer's problem. And those are obviously very correlatable, but it's more complicated than that as well. And so anyway, I would say that, you know, part of it is, yeah, the tech, right? You've got the technology problem, you've got the technology solution, but that it's the last mile that always matters. You know, it's everything after you sign the deal that really matters. And I'd say that's been very successful for us. You know, you want a good partner that is going to make problems go away, frankly. That's what I would, you know, I'd say any CISO is in a position where if they can extend their team, extend their resources, extend their capabilities, that's really what you're after. You're never going to have all the budget you want or all the headcount you want. No one is. That's not what it's all about. Again, going back to scalability, you want to have the best ROI possible, and so I'd say that has been an aspect of my worrying less, frankly, is yeah, of course the tech did what it said, but more importantly, we're here talking today because we've done a good job together, and I'm here saying that I'm worrying about it less than I was. So, you know, really, what more can you ask for? That's what I was after, and that's what I got. Now, nothing's perfect, of course, but that's again why the people matter so much. You've got to have a level of not just effort but care on both sides.
It's fantastic. Yeah, finding a true partner in the business is definitely it puts you in a good place, right? Idan, you know, we've talked about the threats, right? And you know, there's more to this than just web skimming. You know, there's also the privacy concerns. Can you tell us a little bit more about how Reflectors helps with that aspect?
Yes, happily. So we all know or starting to get to know really well about the web skimming, the ability to run a code that collect credit card data or trying to collect some PII data. But actually, one of the interesting stuff that happened because of the increased use of third-party application is that these applications have access, as we said in the beginning, to user data. Now, privacy matters today. We know that GDPR got all around Europe. CCPA is now being approved in many other states around the US, and that means that those third parties are actually creating a privacy concerns to you because they have access to your data. They have access maybe by right to your PII data. Now, the nice thing, and it's unlike the regular thing we're seeing in software, in LAN application, is that they don't need any approval from the user to do it. So let's say I'm a third party, and I decided that I want to collect the user and password of the user, or the phone number, or the address. I don't need any permission, technically, I don't need any permission from the website or from the user to do it. It's just the way JavaScript is working. Actually, I only need one line of code, more or less, to collect all the type of data that the user is going to type on every page of the site. It's not in hacking. It's not if you are only the best hacker in the world, not at all. It's just the way that JavaScript and client-side code is created. It's event-based language, and the await is user typing or keyboard down or mouse up. So the idea that privacy today tell you need to know what are the data you're going to take from your users. You need to get their consent about it. How can you do it if you probably don't even know what is running on your site and what those third parties are doing? So you can't really create a tool for a user to tell them I'm okay with GDPR or CCPA or all the other privacy regulations if you don't even know the vendors. And I will tell you something interesting. Reflected is a remote solution, so it can scan any website around the world. So we are scanning hundreds of thousands of websites around the world. Now, on our default scan, we never click the cookie consent. You know, when you have a pop-up in the website, you say the site is collecting your data, is it okay, and click consent. On our default scan, we are never clicking it. And still, we are finding dozens of applications that are running on me, meaning that even when you think about the consent button, it's not really working today. Why? Not because it's trying to bypass them or breaching privacy rules, not at all. Just because it's a mess out there. A script can load another script that can load another script. A third party can use a third party. A developer can use an open source and that really realize that the open source is also based upon another open source that doesn't protect himself or looping himself in the cookie consent. So actually, when I'm seeing a scan for a professional friend, a client, prospect, and he's seeing the 20, 30 application that's running and collecting user data, and he asks me, oh, you click the consent? I said, no, that's everything that you have. If I'm not clicking the consents of all of these, not one, not two, dozens of applications, those are your current privacy breaches. Now, if you want, I will click the cookie consent and show you which few applications are actually protected by it. And I'm not surprised about it. The marketing team can inject new code using tag managers. The developers can inject new code. They're not injecting new code. They are the code by open sources. The digital team have campaigns with many marketing entities and other tools. All of them just installing code to the website. All of them want to have the best website, to have the best conversion. I'm all for it. But in the end, when you think about the privacy, it just doesn't talk together today. And the first challenge for me in the privacy is first to know what you have. I'm not even tell you to protect this type of data, not type of data. Know the vendors who are collecting data. And then on the second phase, maybe then you can think to allow them or not to allow them, or to ask the question, why do you want the social security number? Why do you want password? I will give another example for one of our clients in the finance area, not a retail, that use TikTok. TikTok is a very known social network today, and I think many retailers and others are starting to use TikTok. And suddenly they started to get alerted for TikTok collecting username and passwords. Now, TikTok is not supposed to collect username and passwords of finance users. So they got an alert from us, and they started to investigate with TikTok. They tell them, wait, it's not us. Of course, why we're collecting username and password. But then after to investigation, they discovered that a mistake has happened. And a new version got released, and the new version ignored the different configuration that said ignore collecting PII data. Oops, a mistake. A mistake that I'm thinking that really happened. But think about it the other way, that now we have maybe 4 or 5 other mistakes of very good vendors or not good vendors that collecting user data, PII data without consent, without approval, and you don't even know about it until you're already in a big mess. So yes, it's not only a security problem, it's not only the web skimming problem, it's the privacy problem, it's the visibility, the discovery, the entire use of supply chain aspect in your own website.
Wouldn't it be great not to have to worry about having those big messes to respond to later on, right?
Maybe.
So, Dan, as a security guy, right, where do you see the threat evolving over the next year?
Next year, those kinds of predictions are always tough. I'd say with this particular attack type, more of the same. It seems to me that what I primarily see is just so much. I mean, we've already mentioned it twice now. The third-party stuff is really what scares me the most. Controlling your own sphere of the internet is actually the easier part at this point, right? We've now spent enough years and enough decades figuring that out. At least now that we've solved it, but it's a tractable problem that we at least understand to some greater degree than we previously did. I don't think that we've really figured out all the third-party stuff. And I think that's going to take, as I said earlier, I think all the attacks around, overall threat landscape continue to move in that direction. And so more of the same, worse, all that terrible doom and gloom, people whine and cry about FUD, but FUD works, and if it didn't, people would stop using it. And in this case, if you want to change the future, study the past, and the past tells us that all of these threat types definitely have life cycles. And I'd say the life cycle of these types of attacks has absolutely been proven. And really now it goes back to the silly word for some reason I'm stuck on this morning, but yeah, scale. I think that from the attacker standpoint, they're just going to continue focusing on how to scale the attacks and hit the broadest threat surfaces they can. Now, what's interesting is that pendulum swings too. You've got attacks that do go broad, but then sometimes hitting one target might actually be more profitable and more interesting. So that aspect does change, and we could see that shift back and forth. But as we just talked about this morning, if you're able to hit 100 victims at once, boy, that's not bad scale with these kinds of attacks. That's pretty good. So yeah, I wouldn't say I have any good news. I'd say it's an overall technology problem that we're going to be facing for some time. It's not only is everything cyclical, but there's also just so much to be learned, and we're doing that with what you guys were just talking about on the privacy front. I feel bad for marketers because really they have to play the game that's dictated, and that dictation comes from the large platforms. It certainly comes from the large social media providers, especially given how e-commerce and retail is now functioning since COVID. And so, if people aren't worried about privacy, they will continue to be taken advantage of. And so it's one of those things where I think the scrutiny around it is good, and that scrutiny will help change things for the better, hopefully, and people will have to figure out more advanced ways to figure out customer journey and what people are after. And doing it from ripping off all their data is not going to last forever, I think is what most of us, at least as individual citizens and shoppers, would hope for. But again, that's going to play out as a cycle of its own, I think, as well.
Now, this next question is for both of you guys. How do you see the new PCI DSS 4.0, changes that are coming, right, impact the e-commerce industry?
You go first.
I will go first. So actually, the upcoming changes, including some new sections that are very specific related to the problem we just spoke today. I don't know if all the audience had the time to read over the new section of 11.6 or the updates for section 6, but the idea that the new PCI version 4 is actually requiring you, if you want to be PCI, and I think all our audience and all the retailers that we are talking with want to be PCI compliance, they actually need to enforce a new way to detect tampering of a change or tampering a change on the forums and of the checkout process when you have a credit card number. So actually PCI included a new requirement. It's now still on learning mode. We're calling it the best practice mode until 2025. And this requirement saying that yes, you can't now trust the official HTML, the beginning of the page. You need to track your site on a dynamic basis, on an ongoing basis, actually after the page is already on the user, in the user area, to make sure the original settings, like the location of the forum, like the type of inputs, like the type of script that's running there, are the same to the entire user journey. So they're actually saying, yes, we know that client-side security risks exist. We know that it's a new problem, and now, and unfortunately from 2025, it's going to be a mandatory to implement a tool, either open source tool like a header tool, CSP, SRI, Reflective, any other vendor in that area, to make sure no one is tampering your checkout pages, no one is tampering your forums, your own forums, and you don't know about it. Know about it can be either alert or block the transactions or inflow or flag it, you name it. There are guides to what to do in this scenario, but you can't say anymore, at least from the new PCI 4.0, you can't say not responsibility anymore. I add the HTML, I add the best code, sending it to the user, now it's in on site, not anymore. You're in charge of the entire lifecycle of the user, server side, client side, and you need to test if someone tampering your code. We actually released a few articles about it, so if anyone of the other audience want to read about it, we offer several articles explaining all the new changes in PCI 4.0, especially for the retail area. So if I want to look, we can share it afterward. But Dan, continue. Dan.
Awesome. I painfully remember PCI being introduced, and I think that we as InfoSec industry at that time really viewed it, we were asking ourselves, I think, who is this protecting, us as consumers or the credit card companies? And the obvious answer is the credit card companies. However, I think we looked at compliance the wrong way. Right? Again, if you talk to any pen tester, any security pundit, they'll moan and groan about, well, compliance isn't security, or it's very low level, or it's not hard to, all of that kind of typical security talk. I think we looked at it wrong. The way I view it, and why I'm in favor of the new additions to PCI, goes back to what I said earlier about the problem with security and the expectations of your customer base and the overall market. The issue with security is you can always do better, but again, it costs you money. And what is the expectation of the customer? The positive aspect about PCI and many other types of compliance, depending on the type, is that it bakes in that cost, right? So you can't undercut your competition by not doing something. And I think that's where the big win is. So the more that we shove into PCI, the more the playing field is leveled, and those costs end up being baked into what you pass on to the customer base. That's where I actually view the win. So in other words, the more mature we get from a compliance standpoint, the more everyone has to play by the same rules. Can't do business if you're not PCI. Therefore, that cost is built into the business understands it, and it's everyone has to do it, and therefore your price point is in a similar ballpark. If you don't have something like PCI, then you've got the same situation where like many other analogies or examples we could throw out there, pen testing potentially being one of them. You've got the ability for folks to really undercut because they're doing a different level of service. I kind of look at something like PCI as leveling that playing field, helping build in that cost, and I long term, now looking back on so many years of PCI, that's the way I now view it.
And Idan, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yes, I will join to what Dan said in the end, that not only that PCI will level the playing field, it also will clear important topic that we have today in what we're calling the supply chain world. Who is responsible for the problem? So if the audience remember, Ticketmaster got breached, I think 2 years ago, 3 years ago even, and they were breached because of third-party app that got breached. So none of their servers, none of their own code is ever been touched. Only the third-party code is being touched, but the code, because of the way the client-side code is working, was injected to all the users of Ticketmaster. And when they got fined because GDPR, they went to the European court and claimed this is not their fault. This is not their fault. It's not us. They the one who got breached, the third party. It's their own servers, own code. Why it is me? Why do you put the fine on me? Put the fine on them. And they lost in this claim, and they needed to pay the fine. Why? because the code claims that if you decided to have a third-party code, or let's think about it in the supply chain area, if you decide to have a third-party code in your own application, you are in charge. You can't say it's not me, it's them. You can't say I am the best, they are not. If you expose your own consumers, you expose your own user to a decision you made, it's on your call. And I think that what PCI did now is actually saying it clear and cut. You in charge, not the third party, you in charge to making sure that all those connections, all those JavaScript iframe forms are doing what you want them to do. And if someone tampering them because you're loading it in from unsecure location or it's sending anything, it's on you. Don't blame the third party. If you can't use a third party, if you don't have the resource to use a third party, don't use it. But if you want to be in the world that we are all dynamic and growing fast, use third parties and put the defenses you need in order to protect your user credit card data is PCI or PI data if you think about privacy. That's your job. And it's a new way of thinking because then us, we're in this area for years and we build the application development lifecycle, that's SDLC. We used to think of how to protect our own code, but that's what we trained this entire year. We're used to think about teaching the developers and teaching and doing for our employees like phishing scenarios and education scenarios. But now in the way the new world is creating, it's important, but you're only strong as your weakest link. And maybe one of these links is your vendors, is your third parties in some kind of integration that you have today. And I think that the SolarWinds attack 1 year ago, maybe not in the web area and more in the IT software, prove it completely. So the biggest organization in the US got hacked, not because they did something wrong, but because they used an insecure software that got breached by a supply chain attack. So if I think about the trends for the following decade, I am assuming most of them will be in that area. To understand that as a security manager, a CISO, and IT, it's not only your LAN, your area, your computers. It's all the connections you have out there, and the world is connected today. If you want to be secured, know your connections and make sure you have the at least decent security procedures, tools, and guides to be protected out of them.
One more comment on PCI. I just want to push one more idea. I mentioned the business aspect. The great thing about compliance, PCI especially, we were saying, levels the playing field. Why is it doing that? It's because it's created a business problem rather than a security problem. And that's really where compliance has succeeded. Meaning that, we tend to look at a security, we look at security like a department, a function of the business. But if you're just a group of people, if you're just a department, that you're gonna fail all day long. Security has got to be a practice of the company and of the people and of the business processes. That's really where you want to end up. The nice thing about PCI or SOCs, as painful as they are, is that they force that to be a business problem, and that the business and the people involved in that all have to understand it at some level. Whereas in the past, you go back 20 years ago, only the people that cared. And you end up in this loop. It's just human nature, right? You don't scratch until you get bit. And so it's just constantly response, and everybody, whining and crying about firefighting mode. That's the trap you fall in, So if you can't have everything being perfect, and that's been the common complaint with compliance for ages. Well, it's not going to solve our problems. As Richard Searson has been saying for years around metrics, especially as it pertains to security, it's not about being perfect. It's about starting somewhere. It's about having a point of relativity. And that is what PCI has, I think, actually provided. So while I might have hated it back in 2006, my view of it in 2022 is drastically changed, because now we have history to look back on, and I think overall it's changed the dynamic drastically.
Thanks, Dan. So Dan, Idan, we've reached the end of the questions that I have for you. And I really thank you guys for being here today. And I'm going to turn back over to Joe. And Joe, over